The Firework. Picture two 10-foot wheels packed with a ton of explosive meant to hit 60 miles an hour, rolling straight at you on fire and completely out of control. Britain built that. On purpose. This was the Great Panjandrum. In 1943, the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development bolted those two wheels to a central drum, packed the middle with up to a ton of high explosive, and aimed it at the concrete wall guarding occupied France. It was meant to launch off a landing craft and roll clean through the Atlantic Wall. The propulsion? Cordite rockets bolted around the rim of each wheel. No engine. And here's the part that matters. No steering. None. The whole plan depended on the rockets firing perfectly evenly so it rolled dead straight. Rockets do not fire evenly. One burns hot, one tears loose. And now one wheel is spinning faster than the other, and on a machine with no steering, that isn't a wobble, it's a hard turn you cannot stop. Every test it peeled off and went wherever it liked. At the final trial, it flipped on its side and charged straight at the officers who'd come to watch, flinging live rockets across the sand while the cameraman kept filming. On a public beach, it worked perfectly, just never at the enemy. The Overkill, 1,300 tons. A barrel, 100 feet long. Shells heavier than a pickup truck, 7 tons each. And it took 4,000 men to put it into action. This is Schwerer Gustav, built by Krupp, made to do one job: smash the toughest fortifications on Earth, the concrete forts of France's Maginot Line. The bore was 80 centimeters, wide enough to crawl down. It sat across 2 parallel railway tracks, so the rails could soak up a recoil that would have flattened anything else. And it threw a 7-ton armor-piercing shell, 47 kilometers. And it worked. That was never the problem. Everything around it was. It arrived in pieces on its own train, needed 5 weeks just to assemble on a custom-built rail spur, and 2 anti-aircraft battalions to guard the sky above it. It fired 1 shell every 40 minutes. By the time Gustav was finally bolted together, the forts it was built to kill had already fallen to tanks that simply drove around them. Largest gun ever fired in anger. 47 shots. The Tricycle. 2 wheels 3 stories tall, 1 tiny wheel at the back, and a Tsar who paid for the whole thing out of his own pocket after watching a wind-up toy. This is Russia, 1915, the Lebedenko tank. The engineer Nikolai Lebedenko reportedly wound up a little clockwork model, ran it across the floor for Tsar Nicholas II, and the Tsar was impressed enough to fund the project with 250,000 rubles. The 2 front wheels 30 feet across carried the entire machine. No gears, no chains. Each engine just pressed a spinning car wheel hard against the inside of the giant rim and dragged it round by friction. Steering was 1 small roller at the back, and that little roller is exactly what killed it. The enormous front wheels spread their weight so well they rolled over anything. They crushed trees flat. But far too much of the load pressed straight down onto that one rear roller which had the ground pressure of a stiletto heel. First test, it rolled forward, the back end punched into soft ground, and twin engines, nearly 500 horsepower between them, could not drag it out. It never moved again. It rusted in a forest for 6 years, killed by the smallest wheel it owned. The Tin Can, 25 tons, 6 machine guns, 8 men, and underneath all of it, a farm tractor. When New Zealand needed tanks in 1941 and Britain had none to spare, Bob Semple, the Minister of Works, decided the country would just build its own. The recipe: a bulldozer chassis, wrapped in sheets of corrugated manganese steel, studded with 6 machine guns, crewed by up to 8 men. And underneath, it was still a tractor, which meant that to change gear, the driver had to bring the entire 25-ton machine to a complete dead stop. Think about that for a second. You cannot stop dead with the enemy in front of you. The corrugated body shook so violently the guns reportedly jammed, and there were never any proper plans to approve because nobody drew any. When people laughed, Semple's whole defense was, and I quote, "I don't see anyone else coming up with any better ideas." The one that reached the Pacific went with the armor stripped off, as a tractor. It got demoted back to farm equipment. The Ball, a one-man tank shaped like a giant steel ball, and to this day nobody is completely sure what it was for. This is the Kugelpanzer, and there's exactly one of them left in the entire world. It's a hollow armored sphere, about the size of a small car that rolled along on 2 fat drums on its flanks with a little trailing wheel behind for balance. Inside, one man sitting on a saddle, driving it with a single-cylinder motorcycle engine. 5 millimeters of armor, barely enough to stop shrapnel, let alone anything aimed at it. So how did it fail? In a way, it never got the chance to. Not one German document describing it survived the war, which means nobody today can say what job it was even built to do. The best guesses are a mobile observation post or a machine for laying telephone cable under fire. It was a solution to a problem no one recorded. It never saw combat, never went into production. And even the story of how the Soviets ended up with it is disputed. One version has it seized from the Japanese in Manchuria, another from a German proving ground. A machine so strange it kept its own secret. The Kite. Somebody looked at a 5-ton tank and thought, what this really needs is a set of wings and a tow rope. Soviet Union, 1942. The Antonov A-40 designed by Oleg Antonov to drop tanks straight onto the front line and to partisans behind enemy lines by air. So he took a light T-60 tank, bolted on an enormous set of biplane wings and a twin tail, nearly 60 feet across, and planned to tow the whole assembly into the sky behind a heavy bomber like the world's most alarming glider. Cut the rope, glide down, land, drop the wings, and drive off to fight. On paper, it is genuinely clever. In the air, it ran into a number nobody could beat. To keep a winged tank flying, the tow plane had to hold 100 miles an hour, and the tank's raw drag was so enormous that the bomber dragging it was flat out and still losing the fight, and had to cut the tank loose early to save itself. On its one and only flight in 1942, the pilot got it airborne, glided it down, landed it neatly in a field, and drove home. That was the only time it ever flew. No tow plane they had could turn it into a weapon. It flew once beautifully, and never again. The Good Boy. The Soviet Union's answer to the German tank was a very good dog. A backpack full of explosives and a one-way trip. This is the Eastern Front. The Red Army is desperate, and dogs are cheap and expendable. The idea: strap around 10 kilos of explosive to a dog, with a tall wooden lever standing straight up from its back. Train it using food hidden underneath vehicles to sprint under an oncoming tank. The lever catches the tank's belly, the thinnest armor it has, and detonates. The problem is that dogs are not soldiers. They were trained on parked tanks with the engines switched off, so the first time they met the real thing, moving engines roaring, machine guns hammering, a lot of them panicked and bolted straight back toward the Soviet trenches, where the mines went off anyway, among their own side. Of the very first 30 sent out, only 4 reached a German tank. 6 detonated over friendly lines. And the moment the Germans worked out what was coming at them, they started shooting the dogs on sight. 30 dogs out. 4 found a tank. The Arsonists? The United States spent $2 million strapping tiny firebombs to over 1,000 live bats, and it worked so well it burned down an American airbase. This is 1942. And the idea came from a dentist whose proposal reached President Roosevelt through his wife, Eleanor, which is the only reason anyone took it seriously. The weapon was a bomb-shaped canister holding 26 stacked trays, more than 1,000 hibernating bats, each one wearing a little napalm capsule on a timer. Drop the canister over a Japanese city, a parachute pops, it splits open in midair, and 1,000 bats scatter and roost in the wooden buildings below. Then the timers all go off at once. Everywhere. And the test? In New Mexico in 1943, some of the armed bats got loose early, and they did exactly what they were built to do, found cover and roosted underneath the nearest structure, which happened to be the base's own fuel tank. The bats burned the test airfield to the ground. The Navy quietly canceled it in 1944, once it was clear it wouldn't be ready until 1945, and by then, a very different weapon was almost finished. The only thing it ever destroyed was ours. The Saucer. A 60-ton tank, shaped like a flying saucer, built to survive a nuclear blast going off right beside it, and it was killed by a memo. Soviet Union, 1959, and this is Object 279, born from the most paranoid design brief of the Cold War. Build a tank whose crew can ride out the shockwave of a nearby atomic bomb. The answer was 2 ideas, both insane, both completely real. First, the hull. A smooth, flattened saucer, its curve calculated so a nuclear blast wave would slide up and over it instead of flipping it onto its back like every normal tank. Second, it rode on 4 separate sets of tracks instead of the usual 2, spreading 60 tons so gently it could cross swamp and cratered ground that would bog down anything else. Turret armor over a foot thick. So what killed a tank built to survive the end of the world? Not the enemy. Not a test. A rule. The 4-track running gear was a genuine nightmare to build and maintain. But what actually finished it was that in 1960, Khrushchev signed an order capping every Soviet tank at 37 tons. Object 2079 weighed 60. Overnight, it was disqualified for being too heavy to exist. Built to beat the bomb, beaten by a memo. Subscribe for more machines this stupid. The pile is deep. Send it to the scrapyard.